Howdy folks, Deacon Parsons here. If you've watched many of my videos, you realize that I support free markets where a willing buyer and a willing seller agree to an exchange. But in my video about the NSA, I pointed out that sometimes we don't have a choice between good and bad, but between bad and worse. The question has been asked of me, are there any cases in the economy where we must choose between bad and worse? There are at least three markets that, due to interventions from various world entities, are not free markets, and they won't be free markets for the foreseeable future. These markets are diamonds, petroleum, and food. Today we will primarily be discussing agriculture and why there isn't a free market in food. We'll also philosophically consider whether a completely free market in food is in the United States and the world's best interest. However, since most Americans are not familiar with agriculture, but almost everyone is part of the petroleum market in some form, I want to use it as an example to explain issues in the agricultural market. Most Americans don't realize that the U.S. is one of the few countries, and perhaps the only major country in the world, in which the oil on the property belongs to the landowner. Everywhere else in the world, no matter who owns the property, the mineral rights of that property belong to the Crown or to the government. This is important for U.S. citizens to understand. It explains why immigrants, especially the illegal ones, have no problem expecting government handouts. Everywhere else in the world, governments have major revenue sources other than taxes and are expected to provide services from those revenues. Another thing U.S. citizens need to keep in mind is that since petroleum is a world market, the U.S. oil companies are not competing against other private oil companies in a free market. They are competing against other world governments in the world market. The difference between a private company and a government is that the governments have taxpayers who don't have a choice. Private companies must operate at a profit with independent customers that can choose not to patronize that company. Governments are not constrained by that market imperative. Governments can borrow funds, raise taxes, or print money. No company can compete fairly in a market where their competitor doesn't have to ever make a profit to survive. Now we're seeing this played out in our lives today. When the price of oil was up, it was profitable for U.S. oil companies to drill and develop new sources of oil. Technological breakthroughs were on the way to making the United States energy independent. OPEC saw this and decided for political reasons to flood the market with cheap oil. A major part of that was produced and sold below the cost of production. They did this to bankrupt and destroy American oil producers. If any other part of the U.S. economy had been so brazenly and effectively attacked by foreign governments, we would be considering war. But U.S. citizens have been so brainwashed into thinking that our oil companies are evil incarnate, that the current short-term low gas prices are coveted instead of the long-term health of our economy and the security of our nation. The fact that once the U.S. is energy independent, the world price of oil will drop through the floor is never fully explained or appreciated. OPEC knows that if the U.S. becomes independent of their oil, OPEC and all the governments thereof will cease to exist. The House of Saud can only remain in power as long as the U.S. buys Saudi oil. The world's agriculture markets are rigged in about the same way. The reasons behind it are much less nefarious, but it is just as limiting. Food is not some random commodity or luxury. It's a basic necessity and thus a strategic military asset. It is worth pointing out that international trade in grains goes back into ancient times when Egypt was a major exporter of wheat. Any country that cannot feed itself is in an even worse strategic position than the U.S. is in the oil market. Many countries subsidize their agriculture producers as a military necessity. But once that market intervention is in place, the free market does not exist. Again, nobody can compete fairly in a market where your competitor doesn't have to ever make a profit to survive. U.S. farmers produce more and better quality food at a lower price than almost any other farmers on the planet. But like U.S. oil companies, they do not get to compete in a fair, open, and free market. U.S. farmers are competing with the central banks of every other government on the planet. Now this brings us to the Farm Bill. Everyone hates the Farm Bill. City people who are completely ignorant about how food reaches them hate the Farm Bill and complain, why do we spend tax dollars to keep farmers in business? Farmers hate the Farm Bill because they're in an independent lot and know from experience that having sixth-class Hitler bureaucrats making decisions on what is best is an exercise in futility and exponentially reproducing red tape. And before someone tries to draw a line between family farms and corporate farms, don't go there. Just don't. There are no family farms in the U.S. and there haven't been since the 1960s. Due to our wonderful government with our wonderful regulations and our wonderful tax laws, any commercial farming operation that did not incorporate is already belly up. If you come across some farming operation that hasn't incorporated, it's either a hobby farm or farmed by members of some religious organization. Many of these organizations have listed farmland as assets of their church to find the protection they need from our wonderful government's wonderful regulations and wonderful taxes. But outside of the lack of market, there's another upside to the lesser evil of government agricultural subsidies. They protect city folks from something they have no clue about: the production cycles of food. Back in the 1980s, when Larry King was still on the radio before his CNN news show, I was listening to him on the way home from work. The call-in topic was that year's Farm Bill. A lady called in and asked why we needed farmers in the first place. Now, Mr. King asked where she would get her food. She said she'd go to the grocery store. He asked her where she thought that store got it from. And she said, from the food factory. Let that percolate around your brain pan for a minute. This lady, and I'm afraid that she's part of a frightening large majority, did not comprehend the link between the farm and her table. She literally thought her food was made in a factory like a car. A high percentage of these people vote. This ignorance is extremely dangerous when discussing and making decisions about the food supply. Now, in a free market, prices are set by supply and demand. If there is a large demand but a small supply, prices go up. If the supply is greater than the demand, prices go down. Now, if we're talking about the supply and demand of an iPhone, who really cares about prices? If iPhones are in high demand with low supply and the price goes up, no harm, no foul, no real effect on people's lives. If Nerdy McNerd has to wait an extra couple of months to be able to afford his next technology fix, it will hardly rate an entry into the historical record. If the supply of food ever drops below the demand for food, people die. That makes the history books in an ugly and brutal fashion. Food matters. Food matters a lot. Food matters to every single human being on the earth. Only water is more important than food. If the price of food rises, people have to put off other purchases to buy food. The consumer economy is based on cheap, abundant food. In 1933, the average American household spent 25% of their income on food. In 2006, the best numbers I could find, the average household in the U.S. spent about 9% of their disposable income on food. Only 6% of that was eating at home, the rest was eating out. So, what does the Farm Bill do for the average American? How does a 16% increase in disposable income sound? Look at your budget and figure out what you would have to cut if you had to go back to the 1933 level. Take that 16% back out of every American's budget, and what would happen to real estate, to automobiles, to electronics, and service markets? And remember, that is an average. If your income is above average, your percentage spent on food would be smaller. But if your income is below average, the percentage you spend on food will be greater. If you like socialism, the Farm Bill is the single most effective government program that has rich people supporting poor people. In the U.S., the farm bills keep food so abundant and cheap that one of the biggest problems poor people have in America is being fat. It also provides America with the foodstuffs to sell or to give to a starving world. It is also the single most effective government program that invests in innovation. It frees up consumer dollars. Would we have the information age if people had to spend their incomes on food instead of gadgets? How many titans of Silicon Valley would survive or never have been created without their customers being able to buy cheap food? How did the U.S. compare with other countries in 2006? Using only the 6% disposable income spent on food at home, here are the numbers for some other countries. Germany spent 10.9%, Japan 13.4%, South Korea 13.4%, France 13.6%, South Africa 17.5%, Mexico 21.7%, China 28.3%, Russia 36.7%, India 39.4%, and Indonesia a whopping 49.9%. Again, these numbers are from 2006. Things have probably changed a bit in some of the areas in the last 10 years, but it gives you an idea of where the U.S. stands in the world. Essentially, everyone else spends anywhere from twice as much to 5 times as much of their disposable income on food than we do. Low prices brought on by oversupply typically make producers cut back production. Why don't we just get out of the way and let the market work things out? Well, in very stark, simple, and graphic terms, because the production time of most agricultural products is longer than people can go without food. A human will starve to death in 30 to 50 days without food. Even the most ardent free marketer will have to at least pause and consider those ramifications. How many lives would it cost to have $100 per bushel wheat? That doesn't even take into account what $100 per bushel wheat would do to the rest of the economy. If the marketplace for oil is low, an oil producer just has to turn off the pump until the price comes up. If the market for Corvettes is saturated, if there are more Corvettes for sale than anybody wants to buy, the prices come down. If the price drops below what GM is willing to sell the cars for, they'll shut down the Corvette assembly line. They can simply turn off the line, send everybody home, and walk away. As the supply shrinks and the price comes back up, GM can call everybody back, restart the line, and start pushing out more vets in a matter of days. Food production is not nearly that simple. Food production is limited by seasons, weather, and the life cycle of the food. Now, most food production can be cut in one day. However, ramping up food production can take at least a year for plants and often more for animal products. I'm going to give city folks a short primer on agriculture and the food production cycle. I'm going to focus on 2 foods, bread, which is made from wheat, and milk, which comes from bovines bred for milk production. In the U.S., hard red winter wheat is planted in the fall and harvested in the late spring and summer. May, June, July, starting from the south and working north. Now, a farmer can cut his wheat production in half in one day by plowing it under. But if it's never planted, or if it's plowed under, he can't ramp production back up until fall planting season with harvest next summer. If we run out of wheat, we're just out until next harvest. And you better hope other grains are available to make bread. How does a Big Mac on a cornbread bun sound? And don't count on importing wheat from the southern hemisphere, where seasons are reversed. There is not enough arable land in the southern hemisphere to feed the northern hemisphere. Now, the production cycle of milk is much longer and much more complicated. A dairy farmer can cut his production in one day by loading up some cows and taking it to market. Now, dairy cows don't make good steaks, so they will all get ground up into hamburger. The price of hamburger will fall. The glut of hamburger will depress other fat cattle markets, which will lessen demand for corn and depress the corn market. Depressed beef market means more people can afford beef, which depresses the demand for pork and chicken, etc., as all the effects ripple through the markets. Now, let's see what it takes to bring the production back up again. A milk cow must have had a calf to produce milk. To breed more dairy cows, the dairy farmer must stop milking a cow, allow her to dry up so that she can come into breeding season. Once bred, the cow has a 9-month gestation period, and then the calf is born. Okay, half the calves are going to be male, half the calves are going to be female. Of the 50% of the calves that will be female, those heifers will need to be at least 13 months old before they can be bred for the first time. Now, add another 19 months gestation for the heifer's first calf before she can begin producing milk. That is 31 months minimum, or just over 2.5 years, to breed a single replacement cow, with the mother cow being out of production for at least 10 months of that time. And this is assuming that we get a female calf the first time. So, we can cut milk production in one day, but assuming everything else goes right, we can expect it to take 4 to 5 years to bring the herd back up to the production level it was before we cut that production. What is the price of milk, cheese, and ice cream doing during all this time? Dairy herds are probably the longest lead time in agriculture. Beef production, cattle for meat, is slightly shorter. Now, hogs and chickens are much shorter since they produce in litters and broods. Now, whether we like it or not, farm bills in the United States keep food plentiful and cheap, not just for us, but for the rest of the world. Keeping American farmers in business is in everyone's enlightened self-interest. My guess is that we will see the world governments being involved in the food market for the rest of our lives. Now for the thought experiment. Even if we could magically remove any and all political intervention from the agriculture market, would any of us be willing to risk the famine? Because no matter how open and free the market is, the market forces cannot change the weather. Food production is entirely dependent on Mother Nature, and contrary to citified notions, Mother Nature is a mean old witch and she's trying to kill us. Having an overabundance of food to mitigate bad years and natural disasters is preferable to ever running out. Farms are businesses. They have to operate at a profit. If they don't, the business closes. Now, if the current farmer can't make a go at the current market price, the next one won't be able to either. Now, I don't know if the way we are doing things is the best way or not, but I do know that we can all complain and gripe on full stomachs. If we have to accept government involvement in any market, this area seems to be the least bad option. In some ways, subsidizing food so that we have an overabundance while keeping the means of production to produce an overabundance perpetually so that we can always feed ourselves and the world, might even slide over into the good option column. This could possibly be the exception to the rule. And yes, it did hurt to say that. Before we eliminate farm subsidies in the United States, we need to be sure that we know what we're doing. Farmers and their families will always eat. The question is, will yours? This is Deacon Parsons saying, love your maker, love your mate, and do what's right because it's right, and devil take the hindmost.